Something changed the second Glasses Malone stopped talking like a guy with a theory and started talking like a man who believed he was naming the engine behind the smoke. At that point, this stopped sounding like another rap argument and started sounding like a public allegation with real-world weight, because when Glasses Malone said he was 100% sure Drake was behind a narrative push aimed at YG in the Drakeo the Ruler situation, he did not leave himself any soft landing. He did not describe a vibe. He did not float a possibility. He planted a flag. And that is why this story has landed so hard. If Glasses Malone is wrong, then he attached Drake to something enormous without proof on camera. If Glasses Malone is right, even in part, then the story is not about a bruised ego or one more chapter in a rap rivalry. The story becomes whether one of the biggest artists on earth let battle residue spill into the real world, into open investigations, into public sentiment, into the kind of pressure that can stain a man's name long before a courtroom ever says anything. That is why people are not skimming this and moving on. That is why this does not feel like disposable gossip. The clip is short. The implications are not. Before anybody runs too fast with that sentence, the line between reporting and rumor has to stay bright. Drake has not been charged with anything related to the Drakeo case. Public reporting we found does not identify Drake in any court filing tied to the homicide investigation. YG was briefly detained during a July 23, 2026 search warrant in Burbank connected to the ongoing Drakeo the Ruler murder probe, but he was released and was not arrested. The Los Angeles Times reported that no one had been arrested in the case as of that article, and Fox 11 likewise reported that YG was detained during the warrant execution and not arrested. So the responsible starting point is simple. The public record shows an open homicide investigation, a surface deposition, a brief detention of YG, and a public allegation by Glasses Malone. It does not show proof that Drake financed anything. And if you miss that distinction, you are not analyzing the story anymore. You are helping to blur it. Still, the reason people are taking Glasses Malone seriously is not hard to understand. On Bootleg Kev's show, when he was asked how sure he was that Drake was helping finance or assist the narrative pressure around YG, Glasses Malone answered, 100%. He then argued that stories get seeded in the music business, that narratives get watered, and that public sentiment can be shaped until it starts to feel like truth. He did not walk the statement back. He did not say he had only heard chatter. He described the idea as obvious, almost insultingly obvious, and framed himself as the guy saying out loud what he believes many people already suspect in private. That matters, because Glasses Malone was not speaking as a random social account chasing clicks. He was speaking as a well-known West Coast voice, and he sounded less like somebody trying to entertain and more like somebody trying to warn. That does not make him automatically right. But it does explain why the clip detonated. To understand why the clip detonated, you have to separate the accusation from the environment that made the accusation believable to some people on arrival. The environment is the post-beef era. The environment is a culture where a rap battle no longer ends when the records stop dropping. The environment is a timeline trained to look for fingerprints in everything: lawsuits, blog posts, leaked narratives, platform pushes, old interviews resurfacing, and suddenly coordinated talking points. Drake exists at the center of that environment whether he likes it or not, because Drake is too large a figure, too polarizing a figure, and too associated with strategic image management for people to view any fresh controversy around his rivals as isolated weather. Fair or unfair, that is the frame. So when Glasses Malone points at Drake and says the money is moving somewhere beneath the surface, a lot of people do not hear a brand new accusation. They hear a theory that slots neatly into the system they already believe is in place. Then there are the hard facts that make the softer speculation feel heavier. Drakeo the Ruler was fatally stabbed after a backstage brawl at the Once Upon a Time in LA festival in December 2021. The case remains open. The Los Angeles Times reported that excerpts from a March 19, 2025 deposition by Alrick Cooper III, a former security guard for Drakeo, surfaced in July 2026 in connection with the civil suit filed by Drakeo's family. In that deposition, Cooper said he saw YG front and center during the confrontation and testified that he saw YG holding what he described as a short improvised blade, identifying him by his eyes, height, build, walk, and demeanor despite a face covering. Those are serious claims. They are also claims from a deposition in a civil context, not a criminal conviction. That distinction matters. But once those excerpts surfaced publicly, the temperature rose immediately, because now there was a fresh legal document attached to an old wound that had never really closed. The next layer is what happened with YG. Fox 11 reported that YG was briefly detained in Burbank on July 23, 2026 while a search warrant was executed at a property affiliated with him as part of the ongoing Drakeo the Ruler homicide investigation. The Los Angeles Times reported similarly that YG was detained during the search and then released, and that he was not arrested. That single fact did two things at once. First, it told the public that the case still had investigative movement years after Drakeo's death. Second, it threw YG back into the center of a story he has spent years trying to outrun. Even if you stop there and refuse to infer 1 inch beyond the reporting, that alone is combustible. A living, active artist with a huge platform gets pulled into renewed public scrutiny in a homicide case that already carries major cultural emotion. The internet was always going to do the rest. YG, for his part, did not leave the matter untouched. XXL reported that on We Know the Truth, a track from the Gentleman's Club, YG denied being involved in Drakeo's killing and pushed back on the rumor directly. The lines XXL highlighted are blunt. YG raps that if the accusations were true he would be in a cell, then says he came to get paid for the show and heard, like everyone else, that somebody had been hit with a blade. The official upload of the song leans into the same posture, not a tidy PR statement, but an emphatic personal denial wrapped in frustration, resentment, and defiance. That record matters because it turns YG from a silent subject of speculation into an active participant in the story. He is no longer letting other people narrate him. He is giving his side, in his own cadence, on his own platform, and telling listeners that the public story around him has gone crooked. This is where the story becomes tricky, because there are now 2 tracks running at the same time and they are not the same track. Track 1 is what public reporting supports. Drakeo was killed in 2021, the murder case remains open, deposition excerpts naming YG surfaced, YG was briefly detained during a 2026 search warrant, YG has denied involvement, and no arrest in the homicide case has been reported. Track 2 is what Glasses Malone alleges, that Drake is helping fund, encourage, or otherwise energize a narrative or pressure campaign meant to keep YG wrapped in the Drakeo story. Those tracks intersect emotionally, but they are not equal evidentiary categories. One is documented reporting. The other is a serious allegation made in interviews and then amplified by commentary outlets. If you fuse them carelessly, you invent certainty. If you refuse to consider the second track at all, you miss why this conversation has such a grip on people. And the grip comes down to motive. Every major public controversy becomes easier for audiences to believe when the alleged motive already feels emotionally plausible. That is why the Drake angle keeps sticking to the wall. The Drake-Kendrick war did not simply produce hit records and fan wars. It produced a worldview. In that worldview, Drake is not just a superstar rapper. Drake is a strategist, an institution, a brand with orbit, a man people believe knows how narratives move and how voices can be mobilized around them. So when Glasses Malone suggests that Drake is still angry enough about the battle, or the symbolism of the pop-out, or the alignment of certain West Coast artists, to fuel secondary pressure around one of the figures associated with that side of the map, some people hear a leap. Others hear continuity. That divide is the whole story. There is also the very human reason this allegation hit harder than a normal industry rumor: it touches a death. If this were only about who leaked what to which blogger, the argument would stay ugly but abstract. Drakeo the Ruler's killing makes it different. Drakeo was not just another name in a feud ecosystem. He was a singular West Coast artist with a distinct voice, and his death remains unresolved. So once an allegation appears suggesting that anyone might be leveraging public attention around that unresolved death for adjacent rap politics, the moral stakes change immediately. Even people who do not believe Glasses Malone's Drake claim on the merits can still feel the ugliness of the idea. It sounds profane. It sounds like grief being turned into leverage. That is why the allegation does not bounce off the audience as casual dirt. But that is also exactly why the standard for proof has to be higher than the standard for virality. Hot New Hip Hop's write-up on the matter is careful in one important way. It reports Glasses Malone's allegation and his insistence that he is 100% sure, but it also notes that he did not actually present proof in the clip and frames the core material as a claim, not a demonstrated fact. That gap is everything. Because once you move past the drama of hearing Drake's name attached to the story, the obvious question is the oldest one in journalism: what is the evidence? Not the mood. Not the pattern. Not the intuition. Not the accumulated distrust. The evidence. Who was paid, if anyone? To do what? When? Through whom? For which concrete action? Without those answers, the story remains explosive, but it does not become settled. And yet even the absence of public proof has not cooled people down, because the cultural memory around narrative management is strong now. Glasses Malone's broader point on Bootleg Kev was not merely that Drake is mad. It was that narratives can be planted, nurtured, and made to feel organic. Anybody who lives online has seen some version of that before. Stories appear in clusters. One platform posts it, then another, then another. A talking point that sounded fringe at breakfast sounds mainstream by dinner. A name begins to stick to a case, a rumor, a suspicion, or a moral label until the audience cannot remember when it first heard it. That phenomenon is real whether Drake has anything to do with this particular story or not. So Glasses Malone did not need to teach the audience a new concept. He only needed to connect a familiar concept to a familiar villain, and suddenly the theory felt legible to people already primed to believe the machinery exists. The counterargument is just as important, and it is stronger than some corners of the internet want to admit. The existence of an open investigation does not require a puppet master. The surfacing of deposition excerpts in a civil lawsuit does not require a sponsor. A search warrant executed in 2026 in a 2021 homicide case does not require rap beef sabotage to explain it. Law enforcement moves unevenly all the time. Investigations can sit, revive, shift, and drag. Civil litigation can surface old testimony at politically explosive moments without anybody in the rap world controlling the clock. And if you do not leave room for that possibility, you stop doing analysis and start doing numerology. The cleanest warning against overreach is that a lot of stories feel orchestrated in hindsight simply because the internet only notices them when several threads cross at once. Timing can be suspicious without being manufactured. That tension, between the pattern people think they see and the proof they do not yet have, is what makes this story so magnetic. If there were receipts, it would be a different conversation. If there were no contextual facts at all, it would have died instantly. Instead, the audience is trapped in the middle. There is enough public record to keep the story alive and enough missing evidence to keep it unresolved. That is the exact zone where hip-hop commentary thrives. It is also the exact zone where people say too much. Which is why the smartest way to read the Drake-YG-Drakeo triangle right now is not as a solved case, but as a map of pressures: legal pressure, reputational pressure, regional pressure, and residual battle pressure all piling on top of one another until every new clip feels like confirmation of something the viewer already suspected. Kendrick Lamar hovers over this without needing to say a word. That might be the most revealing part of the whole episode. Kendrick is not the central legal subject here. Drakeo's case is not about Kendrick. YG's detention was not about Kendrick. Glasses Malone's statement was not framed as a Kendrick update. And still, the shadow of the battle is everywhere in how people interpret the story. Why? Because in the public imagination, the 2024 war rearranged alliances so dramatically that almost every major conflict touching Drake now gets sorted through a Kendrick filter. Was this person at the pop-out? Did that platform take sides? Was that artist visibly aligned with the West Coast moment that summer? Does this new controversy feel like a delayed aftershock? People ask those questions automatically now. Whether that habit is wise or paranoid is beside the point. It is how the culture reads. And YG's position inside that reading is unusually volatile. He is not merely a famous rapper with his own audience. He is also a symbol in this conversation, a West Coast figure, a name tied by rumor and testimony to the Drakeo case, an artist speaking back through music, and a man that some people believe has been unfairly recast by years of one-sided storytelling. That is part of why We Know the Truth landed the way it did. The song is not delicate. It sounds like somebody who is tired of being spoken about as if he has no voice and no memory of his own. It sounds like somebody looking at the crowd and saying, "You have heard enough versions of me from people who do not have to live inside my consequences." Whether you believe YG's denial or not, the record is an assertion of agency, and that is a meaningful change in the temperature of the story. There is also a correction that has to be made because this is where internet storytelling gets sloppy fast. A lot of chatter has framed the YG the Game vs. situation as though a giant West Coast showdown was definitively destroyed by the detention. But the public reporting we found cuts against a simple, cancelled forever narrative. Complex reported on the Compton Forever vs. event and its aftermath, including the Game confirming YG would appear on the documentary 3 and describing the event as more celebration than competition. In other words, the online version of this saga has already started blending verified facts with mood board mythology. That matters, because once part of the story turns out to be inflated, people either dismiss everything too quickly or believe everything even harder. Neither reaction is useful. It just shows how hungry the ecosystem is for a cleaner hero-villain script than reality usually provides. And that ecosystem is part of the actual topic, whether people admit it or not. This is not only a story about Drake, YG, Glasses Malone, and Drakeo. It is also a story about how commentary culture metabolizes uncertainty. An allegation lands. Shorts channels clip it. Reaction pages dramatize it. Aggregators compress it. Fans weaponize it. Deniers harden against it. Supporters treat it as overdue truth. Skeptics demand receipts. Then the very repetition of the debate starts to create the atmosphere the allegation was describing in the first place. That is the eerie part. Even if Glasses Malone turns out to be wrong about Drake, his broader warning about narratives becoming reality through repetition already describes the machine now processing his own claim. The story has become an example of itself. That self-reinforcing loop helps explain why Drake's silence, or semi-silence, matters as much as it does. When an allegation this sharp enters the public bloodstream, every non-response gets interpreted. If Drake says nothing, some people call it strategic indifference and others call it nervous calculation. If Drake responds too hard, some people will say the response itself reveals the wound. If Drake denies it flatly, supporters will say that ends it and skeptics will demand more. There is almost no clean move once a story like this reaches critical mass, especially when the accusation lives in the space between criminal implication and media manipulation. Those are two different lanes with two different standards, but they blur very easily in public discussion. Drake knows that. That is why any future response will be read not only for what it says, but for what category it seems to be answering. If some part of Glasses Malone's accusation were ever corroborated, the fallout would go far beyond one ugly week of headlines. It would force a much harsher rereading of the entire post-beef era. Every suspiciously timed talking point, every platform loyalty question, every whisper about who benefits when a certain name trends badly, people would go back through all of it with new eyes. Drake's critics would say the machinery was real all along. Drake's defenders would argue people were overreading coincidence. The middle would disappear. And the bigger damage might not even be commercial. It might be ethical. Because hip-hop can survive arrogance, trolling, pettiness, and ego. What it struggles to survive is the belief that competitive wounds are being pushed into non-musical arenas where reputations and freedom can be shaped by invisible hands. If, on the other hand, no evidence ever surfaces tying Drake to any funding or coordinated narrative campaign, then the damage still does not evaporate. It just redistributes. Then the story becomes a case study in how quickly a severe allegation can crystallize around a superstar once the audience is prepared to believe the worst. It becomes a warning about the power of distrust. It becomes a warning about what happens when an artist's public image grows so strategic, so polished, and so politicized that people assume secret management behind every development. That would not be a victory for Drake, exactly. It would be proof that his relationship with a large part of the rap audience has become so fractured that even unsupported accusations can feel credible on arrival. And none of this should bury the human center of the story, which is Drakeo the Ruler. That is the part commentary culture is always in danger of losing. Drakeo was not placed on Earth to become a reference point in other people's grievance systems. He was an artist with a sound, a following, a history, a family, and an unresolved death that still demands clarity. The Los Angeles Times article is useful not because it gives the internet another villain to chase, but because it reminds the public that Drakeo's family is still pursuing answers through the civil system and that the homicide investigation remains open. That is the North Star. Not whether one fan base gets to score a win online. Not whether one narrative feels juicier than another. The actual point is whether truth is ever going to emerge around a killing that shook the West Coast and left a permanent wound in the culture. That is why the moral pressure on every commentator in this story is higher than usual. Glasses Malone may believe he is speaking as a protector, drawing a line around YG and telling the public not to confuse seeded narrative with truth. But even that intervention carries risk, because once Drake's name is introduced at this level, the conversation becomes more radioactive instantly. It is no longer only about YG's denial or the Cooper deposition or the search warrant. It becomes a referendum on the integrity of everyone involved. That is what makes the move bold, dangerous, and consequential all at once. Glasses Malone did not just add a side note. He changed the geometry of the whole conversation. And there is something else in the way Glasses Malone spoke that people should not ignore. He did not sound like a man trying to litigate in public. He sounded like a man drawing a boundary. That is different. A boundary statement says, this far and no farther. It says, joke about music if you want, but do not play with a man's real life. Whether you agree with his confidence or not, that posture explains why so many listeners heard menace beneath the calm. He was not simply accusing Drake of dirty politics. He was telling whoever needed to hear it that the line had already been crossed. In a rap ecosystem full of theatrical outrage, that kind of restrained certainty often lands harder than a scream. Which brings us to the ugliest question of all, why did this allegation feel plausible to so many people so fast? The honest answer is not just because Glasses Malone said it. It is because too many viewers already believe that power in modern rap is exercised through soft infrastructure rather than open declarations. They believe narratives are tested in small circles before they surface. They believe loyalists push angles until outlets repeat them. They believe a superstar's orbit can alter what gets amplified, what gets laughed off, and what sticks. Once that belief is widespread, any story involving Drake, YG, Drakeo, Glasses Malone, and old battle grudges enters the public bloodstream already preloaded with suspicion. That is not proof of guilt. It is proof of a credibility crisis. The other credibility crisis sits on the media side. Too many platforms are comfortable living in the gray zone where a headline can be far more definitive than the evidence inside it. A clip with a forceful quote becomes exposed. A detention becomes finished. A deposition becomes case closed. A denial record becomes confession in reverse. The result is an audience that often feels overinformed while actually moving through layers of compression, speculation, and emotional framing. That is one reason this story has been so hard to pin down. Every piece of it is getting interpreted through channels rewarded for heat first and clarity second. In that environment, people do not just consume narratives. They help finalize them. The game's name deserves its own separate treatment because the game sits at the intersection of region, legacy, and perception in a way that intensifies everything around this conversation. The game is not just another name adjacent to the story. He is one of the most visible West Coast figures of the last 2 decades, a man with his own history around Drake, his own history around Los Angeles politics, and his own ability to turn any live event into a referendum on alliances. That is why any rumored, delayed, changed, completed, or disputed YG the Game showdown instantly becomes larger than the event itself. People do not read the game neutrally. They read him symbolically. Was he standing with YG? Was he staying cool with Drake? Was he bridging 2 sides of a city story, or was he deepening it? Even when the facts around the event are clearer than the rumors, the symbolic role the game plays keeps the conversation unstable. In a less overheated climate, that would not matter so much. In this climate, it matters a lot. Another reason the Glasses Malone clip hit the way it did is that people have been waiting to see whether more West Coast voices would say anything comparable on the record. The perception, fair or not, is that many people in rap know how ugly certain backchannel moves can get, but few want to attach their own name to the accusation unless they are ready to live with the blowback. That gives Glasses Malone's intervention a different charge. He is not only making a claim. He is crossing a fear line. He is accepting the consequences of being the person who said the quiet part in a loud room. Again, that still does not make the claim true. But it does help explain why listeners read conviction into it. When someone speaks that plainly in a culture built on strategic vagueness, the audience often assumes there must be more behind the curtain than what has been shown. Sometimes that assumption is wise. Sometimes it is disastrous. Either way, it is powerful. That is why the burden of proof question cannot be ducked. Public sentiment is real. Glasses Malone says it is real. Bootleg Kev says it is real. Anyone who has watched a rumor mutate into accepted fact knows it is real. But public sentiment is also lazy. It tends to reward the version of the story that feels emotionally complete before the evidence is actually complete. It likes clean villains. It likes retaliation arcs. It likes secret machineries because secret machineries make chaos feel organized. The burden of proof exists to resist that temptation. Not because skepticism is glamorous, but because once a narrative attaches itself to homicide, careers, and freedom, being wrong has consequences that outlive the clip cycle. In lesser stories, the internet can afford to be sloppy. In stories like this, sloppiness becomes part of the harm. And Drakeo's artistic legacy is part of why none of this can be treated lightly. Drakeo was one of those artists whose phrasing altered the atmosphere of West Coast rap even for people who never traced the source correctly. His style traveled. His influence traveled. His attitude traveled. You can hear echoes of him in records that never say his name. That is part of what makes the open case so painful. The culture lost someone singular and still does not have finality. So every time the story resurfaces, it brings two griefs with it, the grief of the death itself and the grief of not knowing whether the truth will ever feel whole. When a major current artist like YG gets pulled back toward that orbit, and when a giant figure like Drake gets named in relation to the public narrative around that orbit, the wound reopens for everybody at once. So what is the most honest reading today? It is this: Glasses Malone has made a severe allegation about Drake's supposed involvement in keeping YG tied to the Drakeo conversation. Public reporting confirms an open murder investigation, surface deposition excerpts identifying YG as present and armed, YG's brief detention during a search warrant, YG's continued denial, and the absence of reported criminal charges against YG in Drakeo's killing. What public reporting does not confirm is Drake's financing of any campaign. That is the line. The line is clean even if the surrounding story is not. And the people with the most discipline right now are not the ones pretending nothing happened. They are the ones refusing to say more than the record can carry. But even that disciplined reading does not lower the stakes. Because the allegation itself changes how people will watch everything next. They will watch Drake's camp. They will watch YG's next moves. They will watch whether Glasses Malone produces anything more concrete. They will watch whether other West Coast voices back him openly or decide the risk is too high. They will watch whether mainstream outlets take the story seriously or keep it fenced inside podcast culture. And they will watch the broader culture to see which version of this story hardens first, the version where Drake is being scapegoated for the internet's need for an architect, or the version where Drake's fingerprints are simply harder to see than the public wants them to be. That uncertainty is what gives the story its charge. Open stories force audiences to participate. Closed stories only require reaction. Here, the audience has to do more than pick a favorite rapper. The audience has to decide how much weight to give a veteran voice like Glasses Malone, how much faith to place in official reporting, how much skepticism to aim at commentary ecosystems, and how much room to leave between suspicion and conclusion. That is uncomfortable work. It is also the work a healthier culture would do instead of sprinting to whichever answer flatters its side first. And if you zoom out one last time, the real significance of this whole episode may have less to do with Drake as an individual than with what Drake's name now represents. Drake functions in rap as a symbol of maximum reach, maximum scrutiny, and maximum narrative warfare all at once. So when Glasses Malone drops his accusation, he is not only accusing a person. He is accusing a mode of power. He is accusing the possibility that fame, money, platform gravity, and unresolved resentment can blend into a kind of off-record influence campaign that no one can prove easily and everyone can feel. That is why the allegation feels larger than its current evidence. It is plugged into an anxiety the culture already has. Maybe that is why this story refuses to die after the first burst of shock. People sense that the outcome matters no matter which way it breaks. If evidence eventually appears, the culture will have to confront how far it has let rap feuds seep into non-musical life. If no evidence appears, the culture will have to confront how easily it converted distrust into accepted possibility. Either way, the mirror is ugly. Either way, the audience learns something unsettling about what it is now willing to believe. And that is where I land tonight, not at a verdict, but at a warning. Do not confuse intensity with proof. Do not confuse silence with innocence. Do not confuse pattern recognition with evidence. But also do not pretend this story is small, because it is not. A veteran voice has publicly said Drake is tied to a pressure campaign around YG. A major newspaper has reported on surface testimony and an active investigation. YG has denied involvement through music and remains uncharged in the homicide case. Drake has not publicly answered the allegation in any documented reporting we found. That combination is enough to keep the culture on edge whether anyone likes it or not. So the real question is not just whether you believe Glasses Malone. The real question is where you draw your line between "this feels possible" and "this has been shown." That line is where the future of this story lives. If you think Glasses Malone is telling the culture something it has been too scared to say plainly, that says one thing about how you read power in rap. If you think Glasses Malone overreached and attached Drake to a tragedy without offering receipts, that says something else. If you think the only acceptable position is to sit still until harder evidence appears, that says something, too. But whichever lane you choose it with discipline. Because in stories like this, the public does not merely watch the narrative. The public helps decide which version of the narrative becomes durable enough to survive the week. Maybe that is the most haunting part of all. The verdict in a story like this often starts arriving long before the facts do. It arrives in the tone of coverage. It arrives in which clips keep circulating. It arrives in whose name becomes attached to the case when people summarize it lazily. It arrives in whether YG is remembered as a man accused, a man framed, or simply a man permanently shadowed. It arrives in whether Drake is remembered as a target of reckless blame or as a figure whose reputation made the allegation believable on sight. It arrives in whether Drakeo's memory is handled as sacred ground or as usable fuel. And once those impressions harden, they are very hard to undo. That is why I keep coming back to the same simple conclusion. The loudest thing in this story is not the quote. It is the vacuum behind the quote. It is the absence of finality. It is the open case. It is the surface deposition. It is the brief detention without arrest. It is the denial record. It is the superstar whose name hangs over the conversation without documentary proof tying him in. It is the way every one of those pieces creates pressure without closure. Pressure is what makes people talk. Closure is what makes people stop. We have plenty of the first and none of the second. So now the clock moves to the next stage. Does Glasses Malone add anything concrete? Does Drake address the charge, directly or indirectly? Does YG keep speaking through records, interviews, or legal positioning? Do more documents surface from the Drakeo civil litigation? Does mainstream reporting widen or narrow the frame? Those are the next pressure points. Until one of them breaks, this story will keep living in the same uneasy place, too serious to dismiss, too incomplete to settle. And that is exactly why it matters. Not because outrage is entertaining. Not because fan bases need a new war. It matters because stories like this reveal the operating temperature of the culture. They show what the audience fears, what it assumes, what it forgives, and what it no longer trusts. Right now, the culture looks jumpy, suspicious, and exhausted. Maybe it has good reason. Maybe it is overcorrecting. But either way, this episode has exposed something real. People no longer believe that big rap conflicts stay inside songs once the cameras turn off. And until the facts get stronger than the theories, that disbelief is going to keep writing half the story by itself. So if this story feels heavier than a normal rap scandal, that is because it is carrying too many loaded elements at once: an unresolved killing, a surface deposition, an active investigation, a star denying involvement in music, a veteran accusing a superstar of narrative engineering, and an audience that no longer trusts the line between organic conversation and guided conversation. That combination is volatile enough on its own. Add old battle residue and West Coast symbolism on top of it, and now you have a story that refuses to behave like ordinary gossip. It keeps pulling you back because it feels like it might reveal not just who did what, but how modern rap power operates when nobody is speaking plainly.